Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's Lunch and Learn session. It's June 30th, and we're going to be talking about the Historic Cultural Monument designation within the City of Los Angeles. We're really fortunate. I'm obviously Rachel Mallard, our City Forest Officer for the City of LA, and today we have joining us Ken Bernstein, who's a Principal City Planner over the Office of Historic Resources and the Urban Design Studio. And when I think about we talk about our 4 pillars of urban forest management, thinking about preservation, maintenance, tree planting, and community engagement. One of those elements is tree preservation, and we have a number of policies currently in place within the city and a number of policy improvements and additions that we're thinking about for the city. And the Historic Cultural Monument designation is one that I think that fewer people, at least within the urban forestry world, really understand well and know a lot about. So I'm really glad that Ken's able to join us today and share a little bit about the program and share with us about some of the trees that have been designated currently as historic cultural monuments. So welcome, Ken, and I'll let you take it away.
Thanks so much, Rachel. It's great to be with all of you today, and I'll do a short presentation and give a little bit of a quick overview about the possibility of designating trees as city historic cultural monuments, and then look forward to the discussion to get into this in a little bit more detail. So as Rachel mentioned, I oversee the professional staff that is in LA City Planning that works with the city's Cultural Heritage Commission that designates our local landmarks or city historic cultural monuments in the city of Los Angeles. Hold on a second, my slides are not advancing, so there they go. Okay. Historic cultural monuments are the name that we have in Los Angeles for our local designated historic landmarks. And this actually dates back to 1962. Many people don't know that Los Angeles had one of the earliest local historic preservation ordinances to allow designation of landmarks. And from the very beginning, trees and natural features were included in what could be designated as a city historic cultural monument in our cultural heritage ordinance. We have over 1,200 historic cultural monuments today, going back to 1962, and the Cultural Heritage Commission of the city, a 5-member mayoral appointed commission that we help staff, has responsibility for evaluating nominations of whether it's buildings or natural features such as trees against criteria for historic designation. Typically, trees would meet the criteria. Obviously, they are not design, they're not architecture in the way that many of our buildings are, but typically they would meet historic criteria either based on their association with important people or more frequently for their association with important historic movements or trends of local history in a community. We have a very open and democratic process in Los Angeles for historic designation. Nominations may be submitted by any individual or organization. The majority of our nominations for buildings actually are submitted by property owners themselves, but often we have community groups come forward and submit landscape features or such as trees for historic cultural monument designation. This is an example of some of our more iconic historic cultural monuments that are not trees. Obviously the Hollywood sign, the LAX theme building, the Los Angeles Theater, many of our Broadway movie palaces, or the Eastern Columbia building is a great example of Art Deco architecture. But I wanted just to give you a little taste of some of our historic cultural monuments that have been designated, that are trees or groupings of trees around the city. This is one of our earliest that was designated, so we even have a black and white photo in our database for the coral trees of San Vicente Boulevard. And I believe they have landmark status in the city of Santa Monica, but they continue on through the median of San Vicente through the community of Brentwood. Down in the harbor, the Avalon Boulevard palms. And I know palms are a source of discussion in and of themselves, and obviously don't provide as much shade as other tree species, but they have been part of beautification programs that date back historically. This Avalon Boulevard grouping was meant to really create a gateway to Los Angeles. Historically, the Catalina ships going between the mainland and Catalina Island embarked from Wilmington, and the palms were really meant to define the business district along Avalon Boulevard and be a welcoming gateway between the Harbor District and Catalina Island. In the San Fernando Valley, we have the Dardar cedar trees. This is along White Oak Avenue in Granada Hills. Many of you may know this grouping of trees from the final scenes of the movie E.T. This is where some of the final chase scene takes place, as filmed in the North San Fernando Valley, but designated, I think, even before that as a city historic cultural monument. In the Little Tokyo community, there's a very culturally significant tree that's really adjacent to a city-owned parking lot between the city lot and the Japanese American National Museum, the Aoyama tree, Moreton Bay fig tree that was on the site of a very significant former Buddhist temple in Little Tokyo. And Aoyama was the reverend associated with that temple and the planting of this tree that goes back more than a century as a cultural landmark, a visual marker in the Little Tokyo community. Another very important set of trees to the Japanese American community and the city as a whole related to the designation of this site, the Tuna Canyon Detention Station in Tahunga. And this was the site of a Japanese American internment camp, a detention station that was really a way station in the early days of World War II, as Japanese Americans were being assembled for relocation to other camps, Manzanar and other camps throughout the West. And there was a very heated discussion about how best to preserve this site that's been threatened with residential development. And ultimately, the city council designated a 1-acre oak grove that was the only remnant of what had been on this site. These are some views of what Tuna Canyon Detention Station had been, but it was the trees that provided that sense of history and continuity to this site. There's a very dark chapter in Los Angeles history. In other cases, trees have not been designated on their own, but the historic designation very much hinged on the landscape features and the groupings of trees that did exist on larger sites, such as this one, Chase Knowles Garden Apartments in Sherman Oaks, an example of what's often called the Garden City movement of urban planning and urban design, where you have separation of automobiles from the pedestrian, and here you have a variety of tree species and beautiful landscaped pathways and courtyards that really was the basis for this site's designation as a historic cultural monument. So that's just a small sampling of some of the trees that already have historic status. As part of our historic preservation program, over more than a decade, we embarked on an effort to really take comprehensive stock of our historic resources through our first ever citywide survey of historic resources called Survey LA. There was a multi-year effort managed by our Office of Historic Resources in LA City Planning, but really a partnership between the city and the Getty, both funding from the Getty Foundation and technical support from the Getty Conservation Institute. And it's really been probably the largest, most ambitious citywide municipal survey effort of its kind in the nation. And the idea was to use this survey information as the basis for our long-range planning, to take comprehensive stock to know what and where our historic resources are as we plan for growth and change as a constantly evolving city. And so it's important to, again, include trees and landscape features as part of that assessment, because those are eligible for potential historic designation. So Survey LA is a great tool, and we can put in the chat as well the link to Historic Places LA, which is historicplacesla.org, which is our mappable and searchable database of all of the Survey LA data that all of the finds over about a decade-long period of conducting the survey. This is the homepage for Historic Places LA, and you can conduct searches by themes. You can type in tree or particular species of tree and see what comes up in the database, or you can use the map view function at the upper right to search by address or by community, or zoom in on your own neighborhood council boundary. As an example, this is showing some of the reports that come up for, this would be the Valley Village community in the East San Fernando Valley, with kind of the heat map of where there are potential historic resources and the little pins showing where there are reports available with more detail on potential historic resources. So there's an array of other trees that were found in the survey, and just to share a few of those again as a sampling, such as the Girard eucalyptus trees. Victor Girard was the developer, founder, visionary who created what's now become the community of Woodland Hills, and the historic Girard tract, which was also identified in Survey LA as having some significant homes, is marked by these large eucalyptus trees that remain to this day, but do not currently have historic cultural monument status. There were many groupings found in South LA. We didn't get a photo of this group of jacaranda trees in May or June, unfortunately, to see the purple color, but it is one of many groupings of jacarandas that were significant through Survey LA. And then oak trees as well, such as this grouping of oaks along Valley Vista near the 405 and 101 freeway interchange in the community of Encino. So that's just a very fast overview of some of what we've done previously in terms of designation of historic cultural monuments, opportunities to use Historic Places LA to guide tree preservation and advocacy perhaps around particular trees, and to raise awareness in communities as well. I wanted just to close by mentioning that a number of the photos I've used in this presentation were taken by photographer Stephen Schaefer, and I collaborated with him on a book that was recently released called Preserving Los Angeles, that really aims to comprehensively tell the story of what we've done in historic preservation in Los Angeles, tell that to a wider audience, and to share the interesting finds from Survey LA in every community, all 35 of our community plan areas. About half of the book is some of the interesting discoveries from the survey, and over 300 full color photos. I'm mentioning this not to self-promote, but I'm actually donating the proceeds, my personal proceeds from the book, to 3 nonprofits, but just to raise awareness that this is a tool as well that you might find interesting, or to share with other community members who care about preserving the essence of Los Angeles, our history, our architecture, and our significant landscapes throughout the city. So Preserving Los Angeles, we can share the link to that as well, published by Angel City Press. And with that, I'll close. And this is my contact information from LA City Planning, and look forward to the questions and discussion.
Thank you so much. I love getting to see beautiful images of trees during our lunchtime. So I'm going to share some links in the chat with you all, including the link to the publisher of that beautiful book. And I'm going to go ahead and start off with a question from Barbara. She asks, what about designation and preservation of large and very visible or significant but not protected trees because of their role in a community in being a gathering spot, a provider of shade, and an element that defines a place? So we have some trees that we love in our community. Can you maybe help us understand which might qualify and which might not?
Yeah, I think it's important to, as I mentioned, the process is very open and democratic. Anyone can put forward a nomination, can fill out the form for historic cultural monument nominations, and we have a kind of a step-by-step guide for what is needed and what research is needed. Obviously, not every tree would qualify, even if it's kind of a beloved local tree. I think you need to make the case for the role that a tree or a grouping of trees has played in local history, that whether it meets the criteria for being associated with a community's development, how a community evolved and grew, and community identity, perhaps historic events or gatherings that took place there, roles that trees might have played in the social history of a community, whether it is kind of as a sense of community, or a site of community organizing or social movements in some cases, or associated with important people related to a community. So again, kind of really making the case for why this grouping of trees, why this individual tree is significant in telling the story of Los Angeles or a local community, in helping us better understand, what makes that place important and distinctive. So that's really what we're looking for in the nominations, is making that more specific connection to local history, not just that, obviously trees have many benefits, environmental, aesthetic, and others, but historic cultural monuments status goes beyond that to really make the tie to local history and significance.
And I kind of hear two things there. One is, again, this is just one of the tools we might look at in terms of acknowledging trees in our community and providing them additional protections. But beyond that, this is an opportunity for a community to tell their story about a specific tree. And that, is really an exciting chance for folks to say this tree is important and tell that story, and then have it recorded potentially. I am going to go ahead and drop in the chat a series of links. Don't be overwhelmed. I've got the book that we were mentioning, as well as the Historic Places LA website that Ken mentioned, as well as a couple places where you can see the application checklist and a guide for the historic cultural monument process. The next question I'm going to bring up is, Anne has asked, do we have many HCM trees on private property? Are there any on private property?
Oh, that's a good question. And I'm trying to think. I think most of the ones I can think of, and most of the examples I used, really are on public property. We do have significant trees as well, and I didn't get into it. We also, in addition to our individual designations of historic cultural monuments, we have 35 historic preservation overlay zones, and Anne is in one of those HPOZs, one of our designated historic districts. And in a number of cases, the way those HPOZs review or regulate trees and tree review varies based on the kind of preferences of the local community or the significance of the trees in those areas. So we do have a number of our HPOZs that do provide for additional review of significant trees on private property, and that is dealt with in preservation plans that are associated with each of those HPOZs. So I have to stop and think that I'm sure there are a few on private property that are historic cultural monuments. I'm not immediately coming up with the example.
So I think about the one example you gave, that was the Garden City movement landscaping on that property, and so that would be a private property that has trees on it that are protected, as one example that I saw.
Exactly. So we've had that's a property that actually has had significant change and evolution in recent years. 141 new units were built at Chase Knolls after it was designated. That does kind of show that even designated historic cultural monument sites can continue to evolve. But as part of that expansion, and we had a very detailed landscape analysis. There was also, there were a number of trees that were dead and needed to be replaced, and we had a detailed landscape and tree report that was evaluated by our office, by the Cultural Heritage Commission. I think we even had a subcommittee of our commission spend time at the property reviewing that very carefully. So, for a site like that, that's really more of almost a campus environment, the historic cultural monument designation does allow for a thoughtful review of the evolution of the landscape and replacement trees and so forth.
And that brings us to the next question, which is, I think, one that many participants may be thinking about, which is, what are the benefits of designated trees as a historic cultural monument? What does that really mean for the tree and maybe future development of the site or the neighborhood?
Yeah, so it does provide for review of any changes, tree removal or any substantial, the term is substantial alteration. It's a little bit different with a tree, I guess, than a building, which is most of what we deal with. But it ensures that there's review by our office, the Office of Historic Resources, or if there's a proposal that might have an adverse effect, then it would go to the full Cultural Heritage Commission for their review. And that provides an opportunity both for kind of thoughtful review as well as public input when it goes before the commission. With trees, unlike buildings, buildings are eligible, if they are designated as a historic cultural monument, to participate in a property tax incentive program for owners of historic properties called the Mills Act, which is a state law that we implement. Trees don't typically pay property taxes on their own, or there's not properties with just a tree typically, and no other improvements. So the Mills Act doesn't typically come into play as much for tree historic cultural monuments as others, but the main benefit really is the additional review and public scrutiny that's involved, as well as kind of the celebratory aspect, the kind of honorific, ability to recognize this as a kind of a point of pride in the community, to celebrate that this does have landmark status, and to raise awareness within the larger community and throughout Los Angeles.
Yeah, I think both are important. The opportunity for additional review and knowing that if something is going to happen at that site, that we have a really robust process to look at anything that may be happening around the protected the monument tree, but also again that celebration, which I think is so important for us to have times where we can acknowledge the important resources in our neighborhoods. So we've got several other questions. I'm going to try and go through them. I think, so there's a question around the cherry trees in Balboa Park, which I don't believe are designated as cultural monuments. So I'm going to flag that one for me to look into, but not answer here. Someone's interested in which 3 nonprofits you're supporting with your book, if you want to share that.
Yeah, I've decided I wanted to support 3 organizations that are really working toward equity and inclusion in the historic preservation field. So that is the African American Cultural Heritage Action Fund, which is part of the National Trust for Historic Preservation, an organization called Latinos in Heritage Conservation, and Asian and Pacific Islander Americans in Historic Preservation, APIA-HIP. And all of them are really working toward greater inclusion, both of the historic preservation field itself and of the sites and places that are being recognized as historic.
That's great. Thanks for sharing. We have, the next question is a little bit long. I'll try and move quickly through reading it. This is from Joanne. Why weren't the huge yew trees at the Sunkist building designated historic? We found out too late that the developer intended to cut them down to put in smaller trees and crowd the iconic Sunkist building with market rate apartments. Were these trees not noticed? There was a huge blowback of residents that more than I've ever seen on one chain on Nextdoor when these were removed. How can we get the word out to developers that they can't cut down significant trees? So there's a couple questions there. One is, are those trees historic cultural monuments? I think the question I would wonder is, how long does it typically take to get something designated? And then what is the communication to developers for a historic site?
No, it's a good question. And I don't know, I know about the Sunkist site, and I will say that partly that building is being preserved because we did identify the building itself as significant through Survey LA. So it was kind of flagged as that multi-year project was being considered in Sherman Oaks. The trees were not called out in our survey, and perhaps they should have been, but for whatever reason, the building was called out. The building was called out both for its kind of architecture, sort of brutalist early 1970s architecture, and its association with the citrus heritage of the San Fernando Valley. Sunkist is a very significant company, and the San Fernando Valley's agricultural legacy. So it was called out for that. I don't know whether the trees themselves were part of that story that should have been better recognized in the environmental impact report that was conducted on that project, the environmental review. So I think it's important to flag those issues for community members early on, and raise that when a project is going to hearing or to public review. I don't recall hearing about it at the time. In terms of how long a nomination takes, it's usually about a 6 to 8 month process or so. The Cultural Heritage Commission, what happens is a nomination gets submitted to our office. Sometimes there's some back and forth to ensure that the nomination is fully complete. And once it is, we deem it complete. The commission votes initially to take a nomination under consideration formally. They actually do tour the site. A subcommittee of the commission goes and looks at every site under consideration. And then a final vote is taken. That all happens typically in just under 3 months. And then the city council has an additional 3 months to, if it is approved by the Cultural Heritage Commission, to give its final approval for monument status.
Thanks for laying that out so clearly for us. And then the final part of that was how are developers notified when they're working on a site that is historic? What's the city's process? I'm assuming it's through some of our many tools that we have, but it'd be good to hear from your perspective.
Yeah, so sites that are historic are flagged in ZEMIS, which is our geographic information system in the city, and that's tied to the Department of Building and Safety permitting process. So again, this is typically the case with buildings. Work needs building permits, and so that's a little bit of a different process. So all those permits are flagged and referred to our office for a clearance. Again, it's a little bit different with trees, and particularly trees in the public right-of-way. That often gets more into interdepartmental coordination within the city family, as opposed to private developers. But developers, in our HPOZs that I mentioned, where there may be significant trees, if it has any type of historic status, it's flagged, and they have to kind of come to our office for a clearance.
Great. And Anne asks, I think another good question. I think that you talked a little bit about the different HPOZs having different considerations for their trees, some of them more stringent than others. She's asking, what about significant trees within an HPOZ? Should those trees be landmarked separately? Is it good enough there? Or?
Yeah. Again, it's just a matter of, do they meet the criteria individually, kind of outside. A district is really about the whole being greater than the sum of the parts. It's the collection of the buildings and the landscape together that's significant. The tree or grouping of trees would have to stand on their own. Do they meet individual criteria for designation?
Another interesting question, I think you kind of alluded to your interest in this and in detailing those nonprofits that you're supporting with the book that you put forward. But this anonymous attendee says, I saw a lot of cultural historic monument trees in wealthier neighborhoods, but only one neighborhood that was lower income. What is the Cultural Heritage Commission doing to address these inequalities, or are there any efforts there to address that?
No, it's a great question. We're undertaking a lot of efforts on equity overall. We have tremendous disparities generally in terms of what gets designated as historic cultural monuments, and the percentage of historic cultural monuments associated with persons of color, communities of color in the city is only about 6% currently in terms of reflecting those histories, about 3% for African American heritage. We've just recently extended our partnership with the Getty that we've begun through Survey LA and launched a new Los Angeles African American Historic Places project to really help prioritize identification and celebration of African American history in the city, building upon a framework that we developed about 3 years ago, citywide historic context for African American history, to prioritize historic cultural monument nominations, and really looking at all of our preservation processes and practices through an equity lens, anti-racist lens. As part of that, though, I think we have to grapple with the fact that with trees, we have inequities in tree canopy, as that we all know about, and shade, that reflects some of those larger inequities in our communities. And so in some ways, it's not an accident that Survey LA picked up, and our existing designations picked up more trees in more affluent communities. I think that reflects the reality of our tree canopy and our urban forest citywide. But I think, I think it's interesting to think about how we might build upon some of this equity work, and also think about trees and landscape in some of the communities that we are wanting to really focus on as an extension of some of that work. So I would welcome Rachel's thoughts and many of your thoughts as to how we might incorporate that in this equity-based work that we're doing.
And it's true, as we look at the mayor's equity goal for increasing tree canopy, one of the things I continue to think about is that we can't, any of the projections of maybe adding new trees or planting additional trees or making room for more large trees, you don't get to the goal if you have a continued loss of trees over that time. So which is why preservation is so important from the tree vantage point, as well as from our kind of historic perspective of understanding our sense of place here in Los Angeles and acknowledging our history. We are just about at time. We've had so many wonderful questions. I may pick a couple of them to have you answer for the follow-up blog that we're going to do, or we may just have to have you back because this has been so wonderful. You're such a wealth of information on this topic, and it's obvious that the folks that care about trees in the city are really interested in how this works and functions. And I'm so excited we got to learn a little bit more today. Again, I added in the chat those links to some of the resources related to both understanding some of the historic resources we have in Los Angeles and the ones that have been identified that could receive potential future status, monument status, and the application checklist and a link to the book. So hopefully you can check out those resources and maybe we'll have Ken back. Thank you so much for joining us.
My pleasure. Great questions. I really enjoyed it.
All right. See you all in a couple weeks for our next session on the second Wednesday of the month in July. All right. See you all then.